Hi, I'm Jaya.
I'm Alejandra Rodriguez.
I'm Valerie Torres. And I'm Valeria Ramirez. And the question we're going to be answering in the slides is how does understanding that racism is systemic and that racial experiences are socially constructed contribute to addressing racial inequality beyond just individual intentions and motivations?
To answer this question, we analyze systemic racism, socially constructed racial experiences, and intentions. Then, our group provides our unique perspectives and recommendations for addressing racial inequality, and we conclude by summarizing our findings.
Land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone and the Muwekma Ohlone, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. The Ramaytush Ohlone and Muwekma Ohlone have never ceded, lost, or forgotten their responsibilities as the caretakers of this place. As guests, we recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland. We wish to pay our respects by acknowledging the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush and Muwekma Ohlone communities and by affirming their sovereign rights as First Peoples.
We believe recognizing systemic racism as a phenomenon that initially stemmed from individual intentions but has become deeply entrenched in society's systems and structures, all rooted in socially constructed ideals, is paramount. This understanding is vital in comprehending and addressing racial prejudices, and in the quest to transcend both individual intent and societal expectations, ultimately paving the way for lasting change. To achieve lasting change, we must acknowledge the roots of systemic racism, challenge its manifestations in institutions, and actively work towards dismantling the entrenched barriers it has created.
Systemic racism has many interpretations of what it means, but what it boils down to is the enduring policies and practices that are ingrained within a society or organization that perpetuate unequal advantages for certain racial groups while simultaneously subjecting others to unfair or detrimental treatment based on their race. We learned in the Understanding Terms lecture that this can encompass a range of issues, including but not limited to microaggressions, racial biases and injustices, anti Black ideologies, all often propagated by individuals and institutions of white ownership. Systemic and structural racism are forms of racism that are pervasively and deeply embedded in and throughout systems, laws, written or unwritten policies, entrenched practices, and established beliefs and attitudes that produce, condone, and perpetuate widespread unfair treatment of people of color. Braveman et al., Systemic and Structural Racism. Definitions, examples, health damages. So, how does systemic racism operate within the institutions and structures in America? And how is it different than individual acts of racism? Systemic racism is built into the foundations and fabric of society and functions on a macro scale, impacting racial groups systemically. Individual racism occurs on a micro level, involving bias, prejudice, and discrimination from individuals towards other racial groups, but plays no role in creating the disparities. Banji et al. The intent of systemic racism is to create structural inequality and is preserved through policies and practices within society. Systemic racism is deeply rooted in the country's history of injustice. Injustices like slavery and segregation. Banji et al. Systemic racism is so embedded in systems that it is often assumed to reflect the natural, inevitable order of things. Braveman et al. Redlining is a prime example of systemic racism. It was a systematic and institutionalized practice in the United States that disproportionately affected Black and other minority communities. As Bradman and al. State, the widespread discriminatory public and private lending policies and practices are another salient instance of the systemic racism and have created major obstacles to homeownership and wealth for people of color.
Recognizing that racial experiences are socially constructed is also necessary in addressing racial inequality. Your race is how you are perceived. Despite being of a certain race, if you are perceived as white, you can experience white privilege and all the benefits that it comes with. These benefits are explored in White Privilege: Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack by Peggy McIntosh. I could think of myself as belonging in major ways and of making social systems work for me. In proportion as my racial group was being made confident, comfortable, and oblivious, other groups were likely being made unconfident, uncomfortable, and alienated. Whiteness protected me from many kinds of hostility, distress, and violence. Despite all these privileges that come from being seen as white, it is a social construct with no biological basis. Finally, the idea of whiteness is also a social construct, and this can be seen in the video How America Invented Race: The History of White People in America. After Bacon's Rebellion, the word right appeared for the first time in 1681 on a legal document when the state of Virginia banned white people from marrying Africans to ensure there would not be another uprising between the rich and the poor. This law was able to break the bond between the frontiersmen that had united them for the rebellion. Before this, interrelation Interracial relations were occurring, and there were already mixed race children, but these laws separated the races, further showcasing how whiteness and race were created for an ulterior motive: money and power.
Latinos have varying racial experiences, and an example of this is Latinos who pass as white. Latinos who have white skin and white features may be seen as white people, rather than minorities, as explained in Can Latinos Benefit from White Privilege? These individuals may not face the same obstacles as others of the same ethnicity due to their appearance, and may reap some of the benefits that white people experience. Despite race being based on appearance, there have been times when that is not enough to truly be considered white. Ozawa versus US and US versus Thind displayed how ever changing the definition of race is. The first case argued that anyone with white skin should be able to gain citizenship, but was denied due to not having Caucasian ancestors, while the second case argued that having Caucasian ancestors should allow individuals to gain citizenship, but this was also denied without white skin.
In regards to intention, there are two ways of viewing racism: racism by intent and by consequence. Racism by intent operates on the individual level, such as having prejudices and discriminating minorities. Some examples of this include slavery and segregation. This kind of racism is based on tradition, but as mentioned previously, has no biological basis, therefore there is no truth to this belief. Racism by consequence, on the other hand, operates on the macro level of society, and it demonstrates a shift from conscious acts of racism to unconscious acts. Since it has become institutionalized, it is no longer about individual actions and intentions, which also means people are not as aware of it. There are no individual steps anyone can take to fix these problems. It is a societal issue.
For our unique perspective on this topic, we focus on the economic factors of systemic racism and race as a social construct. Different racial minorities have been subjected to policies and economic exploitations that drove the wealth gap between racial minorities and white people, with an emphasis on power dynamics and control. Overall, this stems from the insatiable desire for money and power. On the chart, we can see the racial wealth gaps over time. Here are some recommendations on fighting systemic racism. Racism is not always conscious or explicit, so recognizing systemic racism is a critical step in shaping policies and reforms that promote equity and justice. So, how does recognizing systemic racism inform policies and reforms? Identifying root causes. Recognizing systemic racism helps policymakers identify the root causes of racial inequality. Instead of attributing disparities only to individuals' choices or abilities, they understand that historical and ongoing discriminatory systems and practices contribute significantly. Community engagement. Policymakers understand the importance of involving affected communities in the decision making process. Recognizing systemic racism often leads to more inclusive policy making, with community members providing insights and perspectives on their unique challenges and needs. Criminal justice reform. Recognizing systemic racism in the criminal justice system can inform reforms aimed at reducing racial inequality in arrest, sentencing, and incarceration rates. This may involve changes to policy practices, sentencing guidelines, and efforts to address bias. Healthcare and education equity. In healthcare, acknowledging systemic racism can lead to policies aimed at improving access to quality care in marginalized communities, addressing health disparities, and promoting culturally competent care. Related to education, they may focus on reducing the opportunity gap, increasing funding for schools in disadvantaged neighborhoods, and implementing inclusive curricula that acknowledge diverse perspectives and histories. How acknowledging socially constructed racial experiences helps in empathy and perspective taking? Here are some examples. Recognition of diversity within racial groups. Understanding that racial experiences are socially constructed helps people recognize that there's a wide range of experiences within any racial group. This challenges stereotypes and generalizations, allowing individuals to see the diversity of perspectives and challenges faced by people of the same race. Understanding the impact of privilege and disadvantage. It allows individuals to see how societal constructions of race can lead to privilege for some and disadvantages for others. This awareness fosters empathy as individuals gain a deeper understanding of challenges faced by marginalized racial groups. Cultural sensitivity and competency. It promotes cultural sensitivity by highlighting the importance of respecting and appreciating different cultural norms and practices. This understanding leads to greater empathy as people recognize the significance of these practices in shaping people's experiences.
Protests are usually the action people take when something unfair happens in the criminal justice system. It shows people's frustration and willingness to stop systemic racism. All people who come together, their goal is usually to lead people into understanding what really happens and goes on in the criminal justice system and to put an end to it. Acknowledge the challenges and resistance encountered when addressing systemic racism and socially constructed racial experiences. Some people are in denial. People refuse to admit the truth about systemic racism and how it affects schools, hospitals, and criminal justice systems. Also, the people who are speaking on systemic racism also face challenges in bringing up her for reality. In 2020, George Floyd was murdered by a police officer, and this can start many feelings and emotions for people trying to get their point across to others about systemic racism. Discuss the importance of perseverance in the face of these challenges. It's important to be consistent and persevere in the challenges we face with systemic racism because we can possibly change something in society, like create a new law or an act, and we don't have to worry about our future children growing up in a school or community that tolerates systemic racism.
In conclusion, systemic racism is deeply embedded in society's systems, laws, policies, practices, beliefs, and attitudes, resulting in widespread racial injustice. Unlike individual racism, which is on a personal level, systemic racism operates on a larger scale, is ingrained in societal foundations, and is aimed at creating structural inequality. It has historical roots in events like slavery and segregation and is often perceived as a natural part of the system.
While race is a social construct and cannot be proven through science, an individual's experience with race comes down to how others see them. Unintentional racist actions could be as simple as customs or routines, but reflect racism by consequence that, although it's not as forthright as racism by intent, still negatively affects the lives of minorities. Addressing racial inequality and challenges involves a comprehensive strategy implicating individuals, communities, institutions, and policies. Recognizing systemic racism informs policies and reforms by identifying the root causes of disparities and allowing for targeted, effective solutions.